A story about a child, family, faith, greed, and war. A story sadly told too often. This week we talk about Persepolis, Undetecting the Marvelous. So, hey everybody, sorry, I feel weird being chipper and happy and saying hello with the heavy subject matter that we're
Yeah.
recording today. But how are we all doing?
Well, yeah. How are you doing, Shahara?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. This is one of the pieces where you read something and it feels all too modern and very relevant, even though it was written it was written about a time that was before this one, but it feels ever present today. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, that wasn't even my original intention when I'm like, ooh, let's do Persepolis. And then just rereading it, I was like, oh, yeah, this is like more relevant than ever. But it is, yeah, so it is. It's weird because sometimes there's these things that, like, it is very solemn and, like, there are some very rough parts throughout it. But it is also fun to read, even though it's like fun and with an asterisk. And anyhow, but it is something that, like, I was very excited about talking about and reading. So thanks for coming on coming on this a bit of a darker, more serious, real trip with me on
I,
this
I
one.
I think that's one of the great things about being able to do this show is we are able to talk about things that are not just like superheroes and science fiction and fantasy, but like these real grounded stories that are human. So Dan, what
Absolutely.
what what inspired you to choose Persepolis?
So I remember, I think the animated film was coming out, and years and years ago, back in, I think it was like 2007 or something. But and it just looked really interesting. I thought it was kind of fun. Like, I always like, I think I kind of feel like I like graphic novel memoirs more so than even just like regular novel memoirs. It Because then you can also see sort of, they can, like, there's literally like a picture painted of what's going
Mhm.
on. And so then I thought, someone said, like, oh, you should, like, if you like the movie, you should read the graphic novel. And then I read it and I found it just very engaging, and it really draws you in. And even though there is like these serious dark undertones, there's this very fun, relatable bit about, like, this precocious child, and the usual, like, growing up stuff that everyone has, whether you're, like, living in a beautiful mansion in a safe country, or if you're, living in a war torn country. It's very, that personality I find to be very relatable.
Mhm. Shahar, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of this publication?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Persepolis is a series of autobiographical novels by Marjane Satrapi. And they are a depiction of her childhood and her early adult years. She lived in Iran and was born in Rasht, Iran, and grew up in an upper middle class Iranian family, but both her parents were active and supported leftist causes against the monarchy of the last Shah. And the title of Persepolis is in reference to the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. Um, so this was originally published in French, and it's been translated to many languages. And as of 2018, has sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. So is wildly popular. Um, and what I think is actually like a pretty good thing is that because of the language used, of the graphic images used in 2014, it was on the American Library Association's top 10 most challenged
Oh,
books. Um,
wow.
so when you're on the American most top challenged books, I think you're doing something absolutely right.
Mhm.
Um, the style is obviously told in black and white. I actually thought it would be done really well at using like shadow because it feels like you're watching like a shadow play. So that was really
Yeah.
interesting to me, and I think it was a really good way of depicting these really heavy topics. Um, and as you guys mentioned, as when we were talking about this episode over text, it is kind of based on, or at least has um references to the art of Spiegelman's Mouse, Maus, portraying the Holocaust through the use of cartoon images of mice and rats in black and white. So it's very reminiscent of that. Um, that's that. It's also like a lot of libraries have a hard time formatting, or at least knowing where to label it in their libraries, because
Mm.
they don't want to put it in the comics section because it's like it's deeper than a comic, but they don't want to put it in the graphic novels either. So I think they put it in it, but it's not fiction. But it's also autobiographical, so it plays with a lot of genre. A lot of people want to call it graphic narratives versus graphic novels, but I think at the end of the day, it does show that comics deserve more respect, and just because something is a comic book doesn't mean that it's just like this fun silly tale about superheroes. And I think Marjane absolutely had that mentality, that these stories can be told through a visual medium, and I think for her it was quite important. So yeah, that's my little history.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing that. Yeah, it's one of those things like the name Persepolis. Like when I was reading it, I had to look it up because I didn't realize. I was like, oh yeah, like where's this title? Like you always usually when I'm like reading something, you always expect at one point someone to be like, we have to make it to Persepolis, and they'll be like, aha, that's the title. But like it's a much more sort of historical relevance, but using that historical title puts into context what's going on with like the revolution that's going on in Iran and how the culture is changing. And then it's very, I think, relevant that it's you mentioned Persian Empire, because when I've talked to people who are from Iran, a lot of them say they don't identify as Iranian; they identify as Persian.
Absolutely.
For
Yeah.
example, like Milo, one of my son's like best friends at daycare, their family they always say Persian. They never say we're from Iran. They say we're Persian.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's one of the things that I thought was, like as the white Canadian boy here, like this is where I try to shut up and listen, kind of to a certain extent, but it is like educational to me, to understand, because there's so much propaganda both ways, around Iran. You have the Persian diaspora, um, many sort of elevating the Shah and the prior history, but you also have the Iranian government, and this sort of shows the complexity, because Marjane, she loved Iran, and she loved her history of her country and everything, but it was clear that there's problems prior to that, like under the regimes due to foreign interference, and the international relationships, and constant history of tragic war. It was like, it's one of those clear views of something that's like, you can't just take the surface answer. There's much more there. Which I thought was, very educating to me, because I've always been like of the opinion, like, no, the American propaganda is wrong, which it is, in like the American propaganda towards Iran. Um, but there are other elements at play here, and it's just a matter of understanding, and learning and hearing those voices. Um, so
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I find hearing like a specific person's voice, like, so that's where I find these kinds of memoirs are actually more educational. Like you can get more, I think, you can really see how, for example, the Holocaust affected people by reading Mouse. You can really see how the Iranian Revolution affected people by reading Persepolis. And I see, like, even like Harvey Peaker has a who did like the American Splendor comics. He has one called The Cancer Year, and like when he had testicular cancer. And I think that like you really get a better sense of how that affects a person and a family through this kind of graphic novel memoir, where it is very interesting. Like you have the like sort of day to day, like almost like the humdrum things of like it almost, I would say actually this is almost like a Persian Diary of Anne Frank in a way, with
Mm.
thankfully at least a happier ending for the main characters. But that same way of like this being her diary of what was going on at the time when like it was really scary, and you see her neighbors, like neighbors being bombed or hauled off to prison and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you want to fill us in on sort of like the overview for the audience of the maybe it's a sweeping
Yeah,
story that covers decades. So
yeah,
yeah.
it's hard to do, I think, like just like a straight sort of summary. And so for me it's more about like how it starts off. It gives the historical context of what's going on with Marjane when she's a child. Debates over like whether or not girls should wear the veil and stuff like that, and debates on how they dress. And then seeing all of a sudden, like as they're just trying to live and play around at school and be goofy, that the you know government starts making more and more strict regulations. And I mean, one thing I really love is like you also see she has these like conversations with God in her imagination that are really sweet, and like that's where a lot of the playfulness comes, where you see her engaging with like the prophet Zarathustra and all these other very like spiritual aspects, where I think it is like you can see she really is this person who is also like she's discovering her own spiritual relationship, and she is a very outspoken child, which on the one hand her parents are very proud of. You can see, because you can see her father is a very outspoken person who really speaks out against the government. And when they did the cartoon, I can't remember if it was the two of the main voiceover actors are Iggy Pop and Sean Penn. And so her father, those two men did the English translation for her father and her uncle, because she also has an uncle who she finds out has also been very outspoken and is in and out of jail. And it's one of those things where, the parents are trying to almost kind of come to terms with like, how much do we tell our daughter? Like, do we tell her like, everything that's going on? And the father being very much like, you have to like being like, you have to tell people like, it's dangerous, they're shooting people at protests and stuff like that, but also wanting to encourage her daughter's outspoken their daughter's outspoken voice, and being that kind of person who is a very and I mean like I find it like very relevant to how, as a father right now with a child and with everything going on in the Middle East, and what's going on in politics right now, like how do you get your child to like engage in things without scaring things, but also if they have a big loud spoken voice, how do they speak out? And so it goes through like a lot of this. And you even see how like her through her history, like even recent history, like her grandpa was a prince, and so like they are like a more well-off family, so they have that. But and like they'll have parties, and as it goes on, yeah, like like the Shah, like and the Shah takes over, and there's hints at it without going fully into it, but like you can kind of hint at like her parents know about like the US government's meddling in Iranian politics as well, because it was like also a time where, yeah, like the US government, where like you could say like, oh, like they're like, no, we need to topple this regime, it's doing bad, but then they just place it with like, we need to put our other puppet, like we don't want this dictator, we want our chosen dictator to run these people,
Mhm.
because they're like, because this guy, he'll probably do the same more or less, but also he'll give us more of his oil, like, and that kind of thing. And so you can really see as that happens, and then how because of the government's pig-headed views, basically, war breaking out, which again, like incredibly relevant to nowadays, to everything that's going on. So I think it really shows that it is unfortunately a very timely piece where then just like, the parents not wanting to leave their home country, but also wanting to keep their family safe, and then eventually having to make a basically make that make or break decision in the end of this first half. Uh, and then I did get the full version because eventually this one ends where she's around, I think 14 or so. But then the second half goes into when she's older and she becomes, a young woman, a teenager, and gets into like, yeah, like sort of really gets more engaged in politics. And it outside, like living outside of Iran. And like it is a very, yeah, I just found it to be very captivating. And a very, like, it's like a slice of life story. So it's not really following like sort of like that typical like 3 act arc like hero structure, but it does have that like beginning of her like understanding and like coming to terms and with what's going on, and like trying to still hold on to that like chance of being like being a goofy kid playing around in the street with her friends, but then that like political or more sort of oppressive outside societal narrative then kind of forces them that like, oh, you can't just sort of like run around in the street, throw off your veil, or be a silly little girl buying whatever. You have to like also then all of a sudden think about this. So it does really have that arc, but it is done, I feel like, in a more grounded human way, just in this much more bigger story.
One of the things I liked was its use of is almost like using vignettes, the individual shorts, because it's. I think if you tried to ground this in the format of beginning, middle, end, 3 act story, it would have. It's such a sweeping story that covers so many decades of her life. When
Mm-hmm.
you encapsulate the entire thing, even if you shrink it down to just her childhood and then like in Persepolis 1 and 2, um, it's just covering a lot of territory, and it would have, I think, slowed it down and not necessarily allowed her to explore as many elements. Because I mean, you have her like the lovely joy of her parents when they visited Turkey and smuggled those posters back, which showed like they
Yeah.
supported her sort of independent spirit and her it's like punk rock attitude.
Yeah.
um and then you have like the at the same time you also have that story about her housekeeper, which is showing, yeah, there were problems in the prior regime. It wasn't a healthy or safe environment either, and that had it, where there was a class system, a strict class system, where you know families had so many children they were literally like giving them away into indentured servitude. Um, and you have all of that combined with her conversations with God and her exploration of Persian history, um, and her struggle to be a good Iranian and love her country. And I think this just that so much. If it was following a standard format, it would have been hard.
Yeah.
And I think this just gave it the tools to cover a lot more ground than it would have had otherwise.
Yeah, I actually quite
Absolutely.
yeah, I actually quite enjoyed the quote unquote format that she used, like if you could call it
Yeah.
a format. But
Right.
I I'm such a fan of somebody taking me through a lifespan in a single story. And the fact that she was a child at the very beginning, and like us coming into the story gave us a sort of innocence. So as she was discovering things, like when it was revealed that her maid was just somebody who came into the family at 10 years old to work for them, was so shocking. And I think that that's when she was also realizing it as well. Like she was only 10 years old when we met.
Yeah.
And that like realizations like that were very awakening for me.
Absolutely. And I think that like it really shows that I mean, in a way, like, her family like is like, they're very much like speaking out against the system, but also like, they benefited from in some ways from this, like the difficulty, like sort of the problems of the past system as well. And having that odd, like, awakening and realization of what it's like for her because she you can see her putting herself in the shoes of her maid who she loves and like treats like almost like an aunt or like a family member. So stuff like that I found very awakening and very yeah, sort of because you don't realize that. And I don't think it's also something that's like just specific to Iran. Like we might not have systems like that exactly here in Canada and the US and in the Western world, but there are very similar experiences where with the way, class system is set up and the way our structure is, where things like that do happen, where you have people who are basically, indentured maids or servants to wealthy families and stuff like that, like the help, so to speak. So I think, yeah, like stuff like that, it is very, yeah, like sort of like relatable. And that's why I found, like Matt said, like that vignette sort of thing, you really get to see all the different aspects of the, like we can take time to go off this way to talk about, her connecting with her maid and understanding that, but then also go off to her spiritual exploration where then she's like kind of being like, where's God in this moment? What, like, God, why are you letting this happen? And then also to like, then having her going off to like listening to punk rock music and things like that also then I find more relatable because yeah, like I remember like growing up and having my period of like Blink-182 and Rancid and Green Day and all these other like Dead Kennedys and all these other guys in early high school and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for adding Dead Kennedys in there because my inner like '80s punk was getting really good.
Yeah, for sure.
Blink 182. Ah.
I know. Well, Blink-182, yeah, much more mainstream for sure.
I mean, one of the things I also thought was really interesting because she really explored, in during the revolution, you had all of these groups who were working together to overthrow a corrupt regime, but one sort of they turned on each other. And that's something that's often forgotten because like we think of it as monolithic. But I know people. I was taking um martial arts classes from a man who was in fact a bodyguard for the democracy movement in China during the revolution. And a
Oh
lot of people
wow.
forget that there was a very strong democracy movement that was working with the communists to overthrow the royal family and the monarchist reality in China at that time. And you see that cycle repeated again and again. I mean, there have been multiple instances where the CIA have funded revolutionary armies to overthrow one government, and that government, like, turns out to be the next bad guy, kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it just it's a repeating cycle, and this is
Yeah.
kind of what we're seeing here, and through a child's eyes and her relation with her parents and how what they chose to share with her, which I thought was
For
really
sure.
enlightening.
Yeah. Like there's even, yeah, like I remember like seeing like finding out about I went to Argentina years ago and like how like Perón was basically like taking over from like the military government and then all of a sudden like he turns out to be a bad guy, like all these things are like where, and yeah, like there, who was it, Carol Zockley, who's a Brazilian Canadian comedian. she has a great she had a great bit when there was the delay in the 2020 election trying to determine who won, and she tweeted out like, my god, it took less time for the Americans to decide the Latin American presidents than this. Like it's so like you can see like how there's like all these different, yeah, sort of like you said, collaborations, but then it falls apart, and then as soon as like one of those people takes over, it's like, oh, like that military general, you better do as I say or then you're out. And then and then they, yeah, turn on each other, and then so that they can be like whoever is then left in the rubble, they take over the government and then impose their own like sort of egomaniacal sort of rulings over that government. So yeah.
Now, what did you both think of like the more personal? Like, there are some moments in this, like not just the uplifting ones, but like when she's getting a little older and is getting ready to move away. That moment with her grandmother, where they're
Yeah.
sharing the room and like as like in tears, or when
Mm.
the Shabbat episode or vignette
Yeah.
where she sees her dead friend's body in the rubble, and she can't
Yeah.
even really identify it. She only knows it from the piece of jewelry. Like, how did you both find these really personal moments that were maybe leaning to the more sad and the more painful?
Yeah, for me, it really, really heavy hit. I think the first one that really hit me was the loss of her uncle. Like when she, as a little girl,
Mm.
like made sure she put on a nice dress to go see her uncle that was in prison because, like, in a sort of sense of the word, like she saw, like, she saw him as a hero, but also those who had gone to prison were like heroes in her mind because they were fighting the fight. And that was kind of the first one for me that really hit of like I lost him. And it's, yeah, it was, it's it's hard to put into words because it's so heavy. But
Yeah.
yeah, what do you think, Dan?
Well, I think I'm yeah, very heavy and very powerful, and also for the most part, like it's not like she like there's no like proper goodbyes or like like in movies where you might see someone has the like well like I might never see you again and they have that goodbye hug. It's just sort of like you have this little moment, this poignant moment, and then it's like, oh, and then I never saw him again, or like we came over for Shabbat, and then that was the last, like next time I saw her, she's lying in the rubble, and so things like that I found, yeah, very moving. And it's like very heartbreaking to see, and I think that's where this very much like childhood perspective I think is extra powerful, because it does show, it's like there's no filter when you look from it, there's no sort of rationalization of it where you say like, oh well, this is in the context of that, so whatever. It's just sort of like you see it from the emotional perspective first, I think, when you see it from a child, or a young person's perspective, versus like the older, like as I get older I find I'm like, oh well, this is like because of this political thing or whatever. But then a young, like a child would just be like, oh no, like my friend, like I don't want anything to happen to my friend. I don't care about the politics. Like I just want my friend to be alive. I don't care about the politics. I just want, to be with my uncle, for my grandma to be okay, etc., etc.
And I think one of the things that I also thought was terrifying reading this is she goes in, like there's often the micro changes, like first you stop calling the Shah like this magnificent person and you tear them out of the book, then you have to start wearing the veil, and then it's like one thing after, and I mean we're seeing
Yeah.
that happening before our eyes in the States right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the US Supreme Court just upheld a law that basically makes it illegal to be homeless. Like
Yeah.
you can be ticketed and arrested for sleeping in the rough. Um, I mean, we've got the overthrow of Roe v. Wade. We've got this sickeningly slow creep of fundamentalism, um, and it,
Yeah.
it again makes us disturbingly timely.
For sure. And even like
Yeah.
stuff like laws trying to be like, no, you don't talk about like, can't teach racism, can't teach gender in class, like can't, like basically like these don't say gay type laws, like no, like what was it? And then also even like Louisiana introducing a bill about where like you have to have the 10 commandments in the classroom, which is in fact like a direct violation of the US Constitution of separating church and state. And because so like in public schools having that, so like a lot of these things where you see, and I mean, I said like even in Canada with like uh certain like copyright or not copyright, but like censorship for programming laws. I think like just in general, it's like there's this weird shift towards like this kind of more like a pressure, like shut down, almost like the system like desperately trying to save itself, being like as people push against it more and more, being like, no, we need to then have more control, more government control and more government crackdown.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it's oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I was just gonna say that it just proves the hypocrisy that these regimes, these systems have. I mean, even in this particular story, and like in my history, I was reading up like martyrdom had been nationalized, and that's how they encouraged young men to participate in the revolution, and then they put social rules on the women to justify their protection, but then it wasn't to protect them; it was to have control, and it was just this big hypocrite, like it was just a ton of hypocrisy. Like in the US, for example, if you're going to outlaw homelessness, then I would hope that you're doing something to support people who are in a position where they are home, like where they're homeless. They're like it's you know inequality
Right.
of it's economic inequality, and
Yeah,
Yeah,
in
I mean,
like provide homes then, and
yeah,
then you
it's
don't
very
have
much
to.
like
Yeah.
yeah, it's very much like the pro life, and I'm doing air quotes there. They're
yeah
not pro life; they're pro keeping women control of women's bodily autonomy because there's no increase in you know services to help these people during the
Yeah.
process of having the child. There's no increase in spots to find homes for parents who are unable to support a child that they've been forced to have. Like there it's
Yeah.
all about control. And I mean, and that's one of the things I found the most powerful because of the perspective of the child. It helped it also show it's like there's this western hubris of, oh, it's the them, it's a them
Yeah.
thing. It
hmm
can happen here, and it is happening here. And
yeah
it's not just
Absolutely.
happening in the States. And the Canadian arrogance of, oh, the US is so much worse than us. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but yeah, Trudeau sucks, but the alternative is a guy who hangs out with neo-Nazis.
Yeah. Absolutely. And
And he's winning in the polls. And
yeah.
and like, the recent by-election is most disturbing because it's like, you know, it's like this is ridiculous. Like, anyways,
Yeah. For
it
sure.
just highlights that this is an ongoing struggle, and that everyone is capable of sinking to these lows,
For sure.
which is
And I mean,
disturbing.
I will like just to add like another like sort of darker historical aspect. Hitler actually turned to the U.S. for inspiration on like how the U.S. was treating like people with disabilities in Down syndrome, where they're like in California, they were like sterilizing them in the 30s and stuff like that, and that was actually like something that like Hitler was like, oh yeah, like this was kind of the inspiration for how he'd treat the Jews, the blacks, homosexuals,
Uh,
people with disabilities.
well, a certain Mr. Ryerson was
Uh,
also used as a source of inspiration for the Nazi regime.
yeah for
So,
right,
indigenous residential schooling, and then
right,
and that
yeah,
you're completely correct about it. Yeah.
yeah,
yeah,
like when you're the team, quote unquote, that inspired the Nazis, you need to start looking at self as opposed
yeah.
to
Be like,
pointing fingers. And
yeah,
that is what is being erased too. That is the history that these people are erasing, is our complicitness. And again, I'm the white boy here, and I mean, like, oh, I'm so woke.
yeah.
Oh, I mean, but I feel sad and heartbroken, and and I am glad there are stories like this that can illustrate the process because it opens our eyes to see it happening in front of us.
Yeah.
For sure. It's, I mean, like it was like the movie, I don't know if you've seen, I'd say an even much more heavier and hard to watch, The Zone of Interest, where very much about, like sort of, I guess, portraying what happened, like, the Holocaust, but it is very much those filmmakers being like, but look what people still do today, where we could be like right next to a horrific tragedy and then just go about our daily lives and block it out and rationalize it and justify it. And so I think that's where something like this, like Persepolis, is really powerful. And I think the one sort of shining like bit of hope is the fact that she did get out and that she is able to spread the story, and that, you know, she is an inspiration, and that there are other people, like, even though there's still like horrible things going on in Iran and other places, but like people always have then like this kind of like the Marjane Satrapis, the other, you know, sort of revolutionary thinkers, and the people who are able to speak out against these kinds of oppressive regimes, because you have that like Persepolis example to look to be like, oh, and there are like amazing women's groups in Iran and also in the US, you know, fighting for their rights. And it is just, it's one of those things where Hassan Minaj said, he's like, studying history is fascinating, it's a lot of fun, living through history sucks. And like that kind of how I would say like this time that we're living in now, and certainly what it was like for, you know, Marjan growing up like during that whole revolution.
Um, I think if people in, you know, I feel weird saying the word enjoy,
Yeah.
but enjoy this. There's a, because I feel like using the graphic novel as a medium allows for connectivity with a story in a way that a lot of people don't have. Um, there's a video game, 1979 Revolution Black Friday, which
Oh,
is a sort of an adventure point and click kind of style game about a photojournalist returning to Iran, an Iranian photojournalist returning to Iran
oh
during
wow.
the revolution, and it's it's sort of following similar themes, following, and it's sort of, yeah. Let's put it this way: the Iranian government declared it propaganda.
Right.
So like that top 10 list, it's probably doing something right.
Right.
Um, so but it you know a lot of the diaspora embraced it, and it's created by people from that diaspora, um, and who still have family and still live, go back and forth between Canada and
Mhm.
Iran. It's Canadian created. um,
Wow, cool.
so I would recommend maybe checking that out as well.
That
um,
video game is from 1979, you said?
no, it's called 1979 Revolution Black
Oh,
Friday. It's
okay.
covering that period.
Oh,
It's
sweet.
2020, no, 2018. It
Oh,
was
wow. So
released.
yeah, very
So
recent.
yeah,
But wow, that's amazing to see that like a video game like that, where it's not also just like, you know, like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, where they'll be like, oh, like here's this horrible situation that went on. Let's make a video game where you get to shoot all the like
yeah,
shoot at the
yeah.
people who got, you know, had to live through this.
I find there's like an interesting parallel between like the genre of video games and the genre of comic books, because they are
Mhm.
often hyper violent and infantilized, and um, may tackle subject matter that is heady, but in a immature or dangerous way.
Yeah.
Um, but when executed correctly and when executed well, can elevate something. And I feel,
Mhm.
Persepolis is one of those instances where it, it uplifted the subject matter and made it accessible in a way that a just a book may not have been able to.
Yeah, it would have been. I feel like it would have been too heavy as a book or like a, you know, BBC documentary or something like that. It would have been like, oh, like, you know,
Yeah, we
like
wouldn't have
watching like,
yeah, we wouldn't have gotten the same insights, I don't think. And this like
uh,
the personability and her sitting in God's beard and being embraced in that sort of way. We would have missed.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why like Jojo Rabbit, for example, is one of my favorite like World War II movies, because I think it has that childhood playfulness, but it never discounts the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, and I
And that
mean,
was
like Jojo, using Jojo Rabbit as an example, you're able to use visual cues to really hammer home moments like the shoes. Like that's
Yes.
that
Oh my
moment with
god,
the
yeah.
shoes is just like, oh, I'm broken now.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Because you
we
up
my
and
wife and I gasped when we're like, "Oh shit." Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah, because up until that moment there it was so kind of joyous in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. And then it's just the gravity of the situation just comes hammered home with a
Yeah.
For
single
sure.
shot.
Yeah. But then still having like fun, like like ridiculous lines, like when like Germany's clearly like lost the war, and he and his friend are like, "Oh, like I need a cuddle. It is not a good time to be a Nazi." Like, and the kids like clearly like like the kids are like, "Oh, I just want this war to go over, like be over, and so just go and give my mom a hug," kind of thing. Yeah, which I think is that universal message that really great things like Jojo Rabbit and Persepolis can do. My dad actually, so like when my dad retired, and like sort of from his medical practice, he wanted to make sure he had a doctor in place who could take over, and so he had this. He had interviewed a bunch of different doctors, and there was a doctor from Iran, a Persian doctor who ended up taking over my dad's practice. And I was talking to him, and he was saying that he grew up in this province in Iran where it was actually like Muslims, Jews, and Christians all lived together in harmony, and it was just there was almost like too much harmony amongst different groups that the Shah couldn't touch it. Like he was like, all right, fine, we'll let that province be. And the fun thing that he shared with me is that during that time, he remember always being jealous of the Jewish kids in high school because when they had like their Islamic religion classes, the Jewish kids could then just go outside and play basketball. So like he'd be like reading the Quran in class and then just looking out longing as the kid as you could see his classmates playing basketball.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, on that moment of sort of unity,
Yeah.
do we have any final thoughts on Persepolis?
I do.
Um
I
yeah, go.
because even from our conversation around like the US, but something that we didn't mention in the story is kind of like the censorship that was going on. Like for example, they decided to shut down the universities for 2 years cuz if they wanted to, they said no education was better than raising future imperialists or whatever that is. And it just it's in the fact that this is one of the top 10 most challenged books, and the censorship that is going on around like gender and sexuality and stuff in US schools, but also here in Canada. I mean, it's happening here too, of
Mhm.
changing of the curriculum, and they're not allowed to touch certain
Yeah.
books. It's
Yeah.
it's a reminder that stories like these are like important to have on our shelves, and that censorship is one of the first ways that we're gonna I put it into better words for me, that like if we take away education, take away literature, then you're developing an uneducated society that allows regimes like these to come at the forefront. But
Yeah.
you guys word it in better words. I don't know.
No,
No, I think
I
you
think
put it
but I
very
think
Oh,
eloquently.
good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
no, I think yeah, that's very well put. Once people are going after the books and like studying, then like that's like red flags like central.
It is a way that they can keep their control over you, and that's why
Yeah.
I'm glad that I know about this book, and I will be recommending it to many people. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's a character on The Wire, Brother Mazone, who says, I'll paraphrase, but he says like most dangerous thing to the government is a black man with a library card. Uh, so yeah.
yeah. Wow. Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a really good way to hammer the point home today. So
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
go out with a quote from The Wire.
Yeah. But yeah, no, thank you. It was great. Thanks for going down this darker journey. But yeah, I'm glad you guys really got out of it the same amount, same of like what I got out from this story. So,
Yeah.
and I
Thank you
got
for
all her other stuff out too. She's got some other like historical, like personal, like family historical graphic novels that I really like. So
Wow,
I'm reading
have to
those
check them all
next.
out. Thanks
Yeah.
for introducing her to us.
Nice.
You've been listening to Detecting the Marvelous, a Far From Here and ShowbizMonkeys.com co-production. Your producers are Dan Rosen, Matt Erdill, and Shahara Ghaznavi. Music by Glenn Bouchamp, and art by Ben Steamroller. Thanks for listening, and remember, true believers, Excelsior!